Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Classical Academy Podcast, your friendly guide to the world of classical Christian education. I'm your host, Dr. Mark Phillips. And before we get going, I remind you every week, be sure to follow us, subscribe, let your friends and family, everyone you speak with, know about this podcast. Classical Christian education is the educational hope of the Western world. Now some questions for you. Does ancient Rome, does Athens, do they have anything to do with Washington, D.C.? Does classical education? What is classical education? Who is it for? And how do those questions relate to the prior questions? Well, my guest today, who's going to help us with this, is Zach Weicbrodt. Zach teaches medieval literature here at Trinity. He's also our senior thesis class coordinator. He's Trinity's Humanities Department Chair and our Dean of Classical Learning, so he's the best one for this. Now, I've got a pretty good quote from his wife, and here's what she says about Zach. When we ask about some interesting things about Zach, she says, well, I don't like these. They make Zach sound like a bug, but he can bounce an infant on a yoga ball for an impressive length of time, and apparently he doesn't understand anything about the beauty of a French door, which I find hard to believe for such a classical expert. But what's that all about, Zach?
I'm all about the sliding glass door.
Okay, tell us why. Let's sell all the listeners out there on sliding glass door versus French doors.
I'm not sure I can sell the most important person in this conversation, my wife, about the sliding glass door, but there's just something about the glide and the ease and the weight, and whenever it shuts, it is shut, and you're not worried about it blowing open in the wind or rattling around whenever you've got some adverse weather.
So there's some utilitarian beauty to it, as opposed to the opulence of the French, perhaps.
Yeah, opulence. We're not about that at all.
Okay, here we go. Okay, now the yoga ball thing, that almost sounds dangerous to discuss on the air. I hope you don't get a call from social services. What's that all about?
There's some, I don't know if you ever, with your children, took them for a drive whenever they could never fall asleep. There's something about being in a car that sometimes just lulls baby, lulls an infant to sleep. But at least for one of our children, we found that being slowly bounced. So I sit on the yoga ball or the exercise ball, hold the baby nice and securely, and just bounce and bounce and bounce. And on a good night, maybe an hour or so later,
so you had the
sleep has finally taken
challenge
over.
Of staying awake yourself.
Yes, so every day was leg day.
Hence the skill. Yeah, that's great. We actually created on the washing machine, I duct taped down the car seat and turned on the washing machine on the spin cycle, and it would give a little shake, and out that colic boy would go. It was a beautiful thing.
It's American ingenuity at its finest.
So for those of you who did not get a chance to listen to the recent Trinity U talk by Zach, I want to encourage you, get on the Trinity Classical Academy website, subscribe to it. I mean, on the subscription on YouTube, and go to Trinity U and find Zach's talk. It was really fantastic. I was not able to go myself, but I watched it online. It's worth it. It's worth watching a couple of times. It is so rich with information, very encouraging, very inspiring. So I really encourage you to do that. But for those who may not have had a chance to see it or hear it yet, can you just give a brief overview without spoiling it for them? Because everybody listening is going to go listen to it, I'm sure.
That's very kind of you to say. Thank you. Sometimes if you have tried to explain what classical education is to somebody of your time and place, right, a fellow American in the 21st century, you probably feel like you are describing something very exotic and weird and strange, something very distant. And sometimes our closest analogs are something from England or something from Italy, something that really just creates more of a sense of distance between who we are and this thing that we're trying to recover. I was sparked on this by a great book by Carl J. Richard, talking about the influence of the classics on America's founding, and he's written some other great stuff. And that opened me up to a whole world of historical study, looking at the influence of the classics, but also classical education specifically in America, and discovering more and more about how classical education has always been a part of the American DNA. And even though we're a nation that prides itself on independence and starting something new, right, something grand and experimental, something very democratic, those are things that might make classical education with its connotations of Britishness or old stuffiness or being stuck in the ways of the past seem very un-American. The more that you dig into this, the more you find, no, actually classical education has been a really vibrant part of America. And as you would expect from an education that many of our leaders, many of the elite class having, especially in earlier times, it really influenced some of these pivotal decisions and pivotal moments in American history. So I was really curious to learn more and discover more about how that classical heritage, one, just what it looked like, and then two, how did it play itself out at some of these key moments in American culture and in American history.
That's fantastic. So the specific title, folks, when you're going to go online and listen to it, what have Athens and Rome to do with Washington? And hence your motivation. Any other, you kind of talked about what motivated you to do this talk. Can you go into a little more depth about that?
Yeah, so the title is a riff on a famous quote from the church father Tertullian, where he asked, what has Athens to do with Jerusalem? If we're supposed to be Christians, if we're about the revelation of Jesus Christ, first to the Jews and then to the Gentiles, we should be focusing on what was revealed in Jerusalem and not worried so much about all of this Greek philosophy, these pagan myths. And answering that question that Tertullian asked became a whole cottage industry in the early church, as some leaders and some Christians agreed, in order for us to be truly and thoroughly Christians, we need to distance ourselves from this old classical stuff. And others mounted a very different kind of response, arguing that no, we should be, as some of our listeners have probably heard the phrase before, plundering what we can from the Egyptians, right? Just as God gave gold and silver from the Egyptians to Israel as they were starting their exodus out of Israel, so too if there's good stuff that is useful for us as we better understand what kind of a people God would have us to be, let's take that and let's use that. So I think the same thing in maybe in a much less dramatic sense also played out in America, as you wonder, okay, what does a heritage that's conservative, that's looking to the past, how could that fuel something like a revolution, something like a political experiment that's never really been tried before? And even though on the surface there might be some things that seem antithetical between those things, in the end, one of the dynamics that's at work in the revolution is the founding fathers were able to do something that nobody had done before because they're building on some of the precedents of the past that they learned and they gained from their own classical education. One of the famous phrases is that the American Revolution is that rare thing, a revolution fueled by tradition.
That's fantastic, indeed. So the uniqueness of America is very real, but it's not completely novel in its uniqueness, is I think what you're saying, because elements of classical Christian education now, specifically what we kind of talk about, they do run deep in the roots of American history. That's what I gathered from your talk. Can you give a few examples of the impact of classical education in colonial America?
Sure. So even in colonial times, as you have early Americans coming in and clearing forests and building for themselves dwellings amidst all of the elements and sometimes unfriendly surroundings, dealing with a lot of physical, material opposition, education, which you might think shouldn't be as high of a priority, was in fact a great priority. You see lots of instances of early settlements building libraries or making sure that a schoolhouse schoolhouse was provided or that education was being offered, even though there were all these practical, urgent matters demanding attention. It's always been a characteristic feature of Americans to value education, and for many centuries that was specifically a classical education. So even though it's true that there were many people in early America who never got the chance to learn how to read or write, it's also true that in America, education, and a really great education, was uniquely accessible to people of all social classes. So there's all kinds of stories about the frontiersman who is reading Cicero to fall asleep at night, right, in the original Latin, or sons of indentured servants being able to make their way through the first educational institutions like Harvard, because even though this was always intended to be an education to breed leaders, it was something that also should be open, accessible to everyone because of some of the high values that early Americans had on the virtues that come from a strong, thorough education. A great little picture of this is one of the early New England farmers' almanacs in 1676. This whole practical manual on how to rotate your crops and what weather to expect ends with a quotation from Virgil, where he writes, Dabit Deus his quoque finem. And this was written, or this was published at the time whenever America was just nearing the end of King Philip's War, a very savage, a very bloody conflict.
Yes.
And it was to these classical precedents that everyone was able to turn and understand this wisdom from the classics. God can bring an end, God can give an end even to this, even to these kinds of struggles. So even though they were dealing with some new circumstances and new challenges, early Americans were doing that classical thing of looking to the past for guidance, looking to the wisdom of the ages in order to guide their footsteps on what might in one way seem like a new path, but also because of their belief in a common human nature of a wisdom that is true not just in one time and place, but for all times and places. They were able to find some of that in the classical tradition that had been passed along to them and that they intentionally cultivated and preserved.
And doesn't that fit even a more modern understanding of truth, is that it is something that as a principle does not change. I mean, that's the whole point. So it does fit into that. That was his quote he gave, his Latin quote was, he kind of discussed it later, is kind of God brings an end to terrible challenges, something like that. Would that be a good way to translate that Latin that you so beautifully put upon us? Yes.
Thank you. Yes. Yeah. God gives an end even to this, even to these kinds of struggles, even to these bloody and difficult conflicts.
Now, the second American Revolution, the founding era. Can you talk about that a little bit? How did the classical models play into that? And I definitely want you to mention what happened with Benjamin Franklin, please. That was amazing.
Yeah, so this
in
is
a bad way.
This is a pretty wonderful anecdote. So in the Constitutional Convention, as the delegates have been wrangling for seemingly unending hours about federalism, anti-federalism, how much power should the federal government have, how little power should it have, how many rights should be given to the states, how much should individual states be able to decide things for themselves. As they're debating this, all of the delegates are drawing on their classical heritage. They're looking to Greece. They're looking to Rome to figure out, okay, what happens whenever we centralize government, right? In order to make sure that the foreign invaders that threaten our borders can be kept at bay, don't we need to have a strong central government in order to project that kind of power? Or is that going to be giving Caesar all the weapons he needs to turn a republic into a tyranny? And so as they're debating these political questions, they're turning to their classical history in order to figure out what is the right lesson to derive from these episodes in the past. And Franklin one morning was just sick and tired of it all. He was tired of all of these quotations of old guys in togas, and so he decided to try and propose an alternative, that instead of turning back to these old pagan classics for wisdom, why not, he said, instead pray to God for illumination. And he proposed that the Constitutional Convention make a habit then of beginning every morning with prayer. And after Franklin proposed this, there was more or less awkward silence for a few moments. And then at the first politely convenient opportunity, the conversation just resumed arguing again about which precedent from Greece or Rome should be applicable to
not even a second
America today. And certainly while the founding fathers weren't rejecting the idea that God could illuminate them, there seems to be pretty clearly the idea that God has provided for them all of these examples from history, all of these wise authors to mine in our own education, in our own prudence for the right way forward. So my read on that situation is others kind of thought that Franklin was trying to sort of pacify them with maybe sort of like a pat or a false spirituality when they had real debates, real disagreements to get to, and that God had empowered them through the gift of reason and through all of this learning that they could access with the tools that were necessary in order to resolve these conflicts in a way that would be most favorable for a long-lived, fruitful state of liberty.
How about a couple of names I'll throw out there? Joseph Addison, Phyllis Wheatley. How would that fit into this particular time frame, this era?
Yeah, so one striking thing that I discovered was one of the most popular plays during the founding era was a play by an Englishman, Joseph Addison, about the Roman hero Cato the Younger, who famously opposed Julius Caesar trying to make Rome into an empire and insisted, no, our old republican way, ruled by laws, ruled by not just one voice, but the gathered voices of the people. That's the way to go. He became a hero, obviously, for the Americans who are also trying to argue, yes, it shouldn't just be the voice of one man who decides the way things go. And a number of lines from this play wormed their way into the hearts of many leading Americans. George Washington, who never quoted any classical authors, quoted Cato. And we never... a manuscript of that play was never discovered in his library, and so the implication is he loved it so much that he committed some of these lines to memory and would quote them to his troops and in other places. In fact, there's a famous story about George Washington having Cato performed at Valley Forge in order to keep the men's spirits active and to keep that love of liberty inflamed in their hearts. Or even Nathan Hale's famous declaration, right? I regret that I have but one life to give for my country, is a riffing on another line for Cato. So finding although it's not in the originals, in this play that was based on this Roman hero, finding in ideas that they could easily access that could animate their own struggles for the sake of liberty. That's, again, another deeply classical thing to find in the past, these relevant models. And it wasn't just blind hero worship either, right? They weren't just casting around and finding some old Roman and following their example. A lot of the things that we see happening were trying to do that work of discernment. Who is a fitting and a relevant model for us? Who, in fact, maybe is an anti-model for us, an example that we see from the past that was perhaps once praised, like Caesar, but in fact should be rejected, and instead a very different hero adopted for our times, like that of Cato.
Wow. As a British royal citizen, he seems like he was even being brave to write such a play at that particular time. Do you know anything about him catching flack from the king or anything like that as a result of this?
Yeah, so certainly a work of art might have a certain interpretive flexibility, and especially when it comes to things that are popular, everyone has a self-interest in not being offended, but instead being able to cast themselves as the hero or to cast themselves as something positive. So I'm not too aware of the textual reception of that particular play, other than that it was wildly popular in America and was very popular in England at the time of its publication.
That's great. And Phyllis Wheatley.
Yeah, so Phyllis Wheatley is another fascinating case of the high value that Americans placed on education, so much to the point that their idea of human value and human worth was sometimes pegged to the educational level that someone was able to attain. So Phyllis Wheatley was a famous instance where a young woman who was brought over through the slave trade from Africa was, as a young woman, purchased to be a household servant to a wealthy couple, and they quickly recognized in Phyllis an aptitude for learning, an aptitude for education. And so in an almost unheard of circumstance, they gave her the same kind of education that maybe a young man of a wealthy household might have, learning the Bible, learning rhetoric, learning Latin, even to a certain degree, to the point that Phyllis Wheatley began to write her own poems. And the ability to compose poetry had been a significant part of classical education, even in America. It was frequently verse composition in Latin was one of the entrance requirements going into Harvard in the colonial time, and even for some decades afterward. And so Phyllis Wheatley, drawing on her learning, composed a number of poems and sought to publish them. At that time, in order to publish something, you had to have subscribers in advance, somebody who would commit to purchasing what you were going to publish so money could be stumped up for publication. And Phyllis Wheatley wasn't able to find any subscribers because too few people believed that a young African woman who was enslaved could possibly write, much less write something that was worth paying money for. So this became something of a sensation in the news at the time, where in order to verify that Phyllis Wheatley was in fact the author of these verses, a tribunal was convened where 18 of some of the leading luminaries of Boston society gathered together to personally examine Phyllis Wheatley and ask her all of their questions to test and see if she could actually be the legitimate author of these poems, or was somebody trying to play some kind of weird publicity trick. This number included the governor of Massachusetts, as well as some other leading lights of the community. And in the end, they were satisfied completely that Phyllis Wheatley had composed these poems on her own. They signed a document attesting that she was indeed verified to be the author, and that hers was a voice to be trusted in even publication. And so this made quite a stir at the time, as a sign that, contradicting some of the racial ideas that were unfortunately affecting and preventing, in many cases, people from certain persons from getting an education, but also giving a young black woman a voice in America at that time was a really profound move that ended up opening educational horizons to a variety of other persons, and landing a significant blow for the value of all human life, not just for ones that happen to fit a certain mold or to appear in a certain way.
And what a tremendous ally that story must have been to the abolitionist movement. I mean, that's fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. Ideas about the inhumanity or the second-class nature of certain persons, according to what at the time were modern racial ideas, were easily put to flight by her example.
So speaking of slavery makes me think, of course, about the Civil War. So let's jump on ahead deep into the 19th century. What about that era and this talk? What do Athens and Rome have to do with Washington?
Yeah, so this speaks to the way that classical education, while there's some things that are perennial, some things that are timeless about it, it's also something that is in constant change, whether you think about that as growth or alteration. Greek literature, although it was present in colonial times and in the founding era as a small part of education, in fact became even more prominent than Latin or Roman culture as we got into the 19th century. And some reasons for this are obvious. Greece was the land of democracy, and America increasingly was moving from a republic to a democracy, where the rights of the individual person, the expansion of power and the franchise was happening everywhere. And so more and more Americans began looking back to not Republican Rome, which, even though you weren't led by a single emperor, but it was a small group of people making the decisions, democratic Athens, and some of those city-states began to become more and more significant as models to guide America. And so you see the rise of Greek literature in the curriculum. You see Greek being taught more and more, in some cases even outstripping Latin as the most common classical language being instructed in, so that the individual examples of heroes from Greece, as well as some of those Greek texts, the philosophy in particular, as well as the plays and the tragedies, became in greater currency for Americans.
Fantastic. So our time's wrapping up here. Again, everybody, I really encourage everyone to listen to this talk. It is so worthy of your time. You'll actually want to hear it again after you watch it. So please get on the Trinity U portion of the Trinity Classical Academy site on YouTube. So let's just wrap it up with this. What would you say is kind of the big takeaway from this discussion, from this question you were answering in your talk?
So as America kept looking back towards Greece as a model, as a kind of appropriate mirror for itself, it really speaks to an enduring value of classical education, which is education is paideia, right? Education is the formation of a people. And as Americans were figuring out how to form themselves, and that continued to include more and more persons who had previously been excluded from the decision makers, people who had the power of voting, that Greek model became more and more significant as they sought to understand how to properly form themselves as a group of people. And one of the things that really emerges to me as we see countless examples of that is the way that classical education was able to provide a corrective to contemporary prejudices. That far from just being a sort of empty status symbol that those who have power get to wield and maybe beat the heads of those who are less privileged than they are, really classical education served as a point of contradiction for those who wanted to just wield contemporary prejudices to exclude others or justify their own hold on power. Two examples from both the Civil War and after really stand out. You have instances like W.E.B. Du Bois, famously whenever he was speaking to a group of people in Atlanta and arguing for the formation of a liberal arts university, not one that would just teach practical arts, not just ones that would help people become productive commercial members of society, but ones that would teach virtue, ones that would teach wisdom. He used the founding of Atlanta, named after the Greek heroine of Atalanta, who famously was faster than any man and was uninterested in marrying anyone she could beat in a race. And so she ended up losing a race because she was tricked by a clever suitor who, while losing the race, tossed a golden apple to distract her so that she would go retrieve the apple and he could run past the finish line and thus win her hand. And Du Bois found in this a really powerful corrective for those who would only seek to offer the golden apple, only seek material advancement, only offer an education to a growing community of Black Americans that would only meet the financial, the commercial, their economic needs, their practical needs, but at the expense of the soul formation that a true classical education would offer. And so Du Bois wasn't interested in having a degraded version or a lesser version of education offered to these Americans who are just finding their place of influence and finding their place no longer being excluded from the halls of power or from the common life of America together. And he thought a classical education was necessary in order to help form persons who could then properly take their place in a republic, in a nation like America.
Indeed. Hence, we are doing what we are doing here, and you see the classical Christian education movement growing, and we're doing what we're doing because it's not delivering golden apples, but it is delivering virtue and those very important things that you've spoken of. And so again, I encourage everyone, get on Trinity U at the Trinity Classical Academy place on YouTube. Get a good listen to this. Zach, thank you so much for the hard work you did in preparing this talk. It was obviously very studious. It was very clear you worked very hard and cared deeply about this. And I think that care that you have is contagious. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Mark. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah. And thank all of you for joining us again here on the Classical Academy podcast, presented by Trinity U, a service of Trinity Classical Academy here in Santa Clarita. Our producer is Shay Ramquist. Stephen Petrie is our audio engineer and provides our original music. So until next time, let's grow in virtue, wisdom, purpose, and courage, and in the love of God. Till next time.